Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. In your recent book, you have a line about, I'm just quoting, it says, perhaps the most significant difference between the physical and the digital world is that our knowledge of the natural world is mostly tacit, while our knowledge in the digital world is explicit.
Mm-hmm.
Is this statement, do you think, one of the root causes why you and I and a whole industry full of identity folks are trying to solve problems online today because of this big difference between how knowledge is expressed in the physical versus digital world?
Yeah, I think that is one of the fundamental issues, right? That's what causes most of the quote problems of identity. And we're trying to build digital systems that in some ways replicate that tacit understanding that we have in the physical world. You know, an example of that is that in the physical world, we don't need an identity system to help us recognize and remember people we interact with. We just do that. And we can't explain how we do it. That's why it's tacit, right? That's what tacit means. We can't explain it, but we just do it. And everybody does it. Babies do it. I mean, it's just built into us. And so, you know, there is some kind of identity system there, but we don't ever have to think about it or worry about it. It's just part of the foundation of life. In a digital world, of course, that doesn't exist. There's no way for me to recognize you at the end of a digital connection without that digital connection providing the things that I need in order to recognize you. And then I need tools to remember you. And all of that is just something that we're building. And, you know, I think we're getting closer to having it right, but we're not there yet.
It's something about being in the same room together or seeing people, something about just the human experience being physical. And it's crazy now, even being on a Zoom call together and being able to see each other, you kind of build a level of trust that you necessarily don't have if you're chatting or if you're using another medium. But it's kind of crazy even seeing the advancements now in the digital space where you could start spoofing stuff even physically that I don't even think would be possible in the physical world.
Yeah. Deep fakes. I mean, you know, right now I'm obviously talking to you because I know you and I recognize you and I can see your face. But with deep fakes, I mean, maybe it could be, you know, a Russian troll and, you know, they're just using deep fakes to look like you.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing that you use to describe digital identity or how to view digital identities in terms of its locus of control. And so who or what controls the relationship? So just control being kind of the powerful term there. Do you mind breaking that down a little bit more, just an understanding why using that lens of a locus of control is something that's helpful in the context of digital ID, again, versus physical interactions, or is it the same thing?
So that's exactly where I was going to go, is tie it back to our last comment about the physical and digital. In the physical world, the locus of control is you. You clearly are an autonomous entity. You have your own means of recognizing, remembering, and reacting to other things, and not just people, but, you know, everything in your environment. And that locus of control, like I said, is based in you, right? And yeah, I mean, we can get into, you know, the discussions of, you know, governance and all of that, and how as humans we've built societies that transfer some of that control out, but still the locus of control is you. In digital identity, maybe it's a historical accident based on the fact that, you know, most of the early users of the internet were on some sort of large computer like a VAX and had an account there, right? We've just gone this route of assuming that someone else has to be the control point, that some other entity is deciding how you are recognized, how you remember things. And I call these administrative identity systems. And most administrative identity systems are also intervening, meaning that they're sitting between you and whatever you're trying to do. So in the digital world, almost all of our identity information, right, usernames and passwords and everything else is controlled by some other entity. When you use, Google to log in, or, we use your Apple ID or whatever, they're controlling that. Even if you just use an account, you go to Amazon and shop or whatever and use your account, they control the account. They decide how it's used. They decide the terms and conditions. They decide what it's capable of doing, what attributes are important. And that's fine, right? I mean, I've been there. When you build something like that, you have to figure out how you're going to interact with your customers, right? You're creating a relationship, which is, one of the things I think is important about identity is recognizing that it's about relationships. So yeah, we haven't gotten to the point in digital identity yet. I think we're headed there, but we're not quite there yet, of saying the person or thing or organization, whatever entity we're talking about, should be the locus of control for their interactions. That doesn't mean that they have 100% control over everyone else. It just means that they are in control of how they interact.
Yeah, which would get it closer to the way it is in the physical world today. Like you said, we're our own locus of control. I think people get it wrong often too, thinking that like you still won't have accounts, or you still won't be sharing data and stuff like that, even with user-controlled digital identity systems. It's just, again, everyone is their own sovereign individual. Everyone has their own requirements, their own policies, their own rules, and the way you decide to interact with them is based on that, basically. If there's value in having those interactions or building a relationship, then you will do it. And that kind of gets me into one of the other things that we don't really have in the digital space today, talking about relationships, that does exist in the physical world, is just the concept of having permanent versus short-lived relationships, where in your day-to-day life, you have tons of interactions where you're not necessarily making meaningful connections with someone, but you could be saying hi to someone you see every day. You could be doing a specific action, but you're not necessarily going to be exchanging tons of information or knowing personal details about each other. Could you maybe dive a little bit deeper into why that is missing in the digital space today, and kind of what the difference are between the two of them?
So going back to the idea of relationships, right? I maintain that we build identity systems not to manage identities, but to manage relationships. And that every interaction we have, and let's think about the physical world for a minute, every interaction we have in the physical world, we're creating a relationship. Now that's a little bit, people might, squint at my use of the term for relationship there, but it is in a sense. So like if I go into the, corner convenience store, to buy a Coke, there are people in there, and, some of them I interact with. I might say hello to the person standing next to me at the fountain machine or whatever. I'm going to interact with the clerk. In each of those instances, I've created a relationship, albeit ephemeral, right? Short-lived. Unless I go there all the time and the clerk happens to know me or recognize me, the relationship is just based on the need for that particular transaction or that particular interaction. And as soon as it's done, the relationship is torn down and, it doesn't exist anymore. In a digital world, that is rarely the case, right? We almost never create ephemeral relationships. I think that a good example of that most people have probably seen is the idea of checkout as guest, right? So I recently, a year ago or so ago, bought some specialty bolts for something. And, I don't buy specialty bolts all the time. I went to the website, found the bolts I needed. They allowed me to check out as a guest. I did. And, so we had a short-lived relationship, just long enough for me to buy the bolts. On the other hand, I have a long-lived relationship with Amazon, and I like that relationship, right? Because I like having them remember what books I've read, and so I don't rebuy the same book over and over, which I've done in the past. I like being able to say, oh, I remember I ordered some of those. What were they? And being able to go search. So I like that that's a long-lived relationship. I think you ask why we don't have short-lived relationships. I think part of it is because the internet, the World Wide Web, almost exclusively has developed transactional relationships based on businesses that want to do something, right? I mean, everybody's building an online company and needs identity in order for it to work. And, almost always you have this this strong desire as a company to have long-lived relationships because you want to build a market to people. And we could get into surveillance. I'll leave that for a different topic if you want to get into that. But there's lots of reasons why companies prefer the long-lived relationship. But in fact, I think there's lots of things in the digital world where we don't need one. If I'm using an ID badge, for example, to a virtual ID badge on my phone to open a door, I don't need a long-lived relationship with the door. I just need to open it. So I think we need to explore this concept of ephemeral or short-lived interactions a lot more inside the digital identity space.
All these concepts are all interrelated. So it's amazing how you were able to split all these things out in your new book, and there's a lot of tiebacks one to another, but all these concepts that we were talking about are in some way or another interrelated. But it makes me think of, like, for example, when I go to the bank and I go see a teller because I have to conduct a specific transaction that my bank doesn't allow me to do for risk reasons online or even at a bank machine, but I have to go see a teller. And I've been going to this bank for a couple of years now. There's usually a teller that recognizes me. She's helped me conduct transactions before. She doesn't even check my ID or KYC me, right, when I walk in, because there's kind of that level of trust built up. I have a specific type of relationship with the bank. It's kind of a permanent or long-term relationship that I have with the bank, which again, I'm okay with that and I want that. But my relationship with the clerk or the teller is a different type of relationship. And the clerk or the teller probably doesn't even know my name. Maybe she does when I walk in and she's able to see it there, but it's not based on my identity or my name that she's able to kind of build confidence that, okay, yeah, this is the person that is has a relationship with this company, for example, and is coming in to make certain transactions. So there's a kind of like pseudonymity in my identity with this person where they don't necessarily have all of my government information to be able to identify everything from my birth date to my home address to whatever. And there's also been a lot of discussions online recently, like with the Twitter stuff happening, where they're trying to figure out how to they want to be able to identify people because they think the experience for a natural person should be, or a natural person associated with I guess government ID should be different than a person associated with a pseudonymous ID, which I have some thoughts about, because it's not the way that it works necessarily in the real world today, that we're able to have pseudonymous interactions. Yeah, it would be interesting. And I think this is one of the other things that doesn't exist on the internet very well today, or at least identity systems don't allow for this quite well, as this, and you call it the fluid multi-pseudonymity. And so would be interested to hear your thoughts on all of this.
I first heard that term from Emil Soderov, the concept of fluid multi-pseudonymity. And the idea, I mean, it's kind of a big word for what I think of as a natural concept. And that is, like you said, I mean, when you walk in the bank, you have a relationship, but it's pseudonymous, right? She recognizes you, but she doesn't know very much about you. Nevertheless, there's a relationship there, and it's not strictly transactional. Your relationship with the bank is transactional, but with the teller, there's more of a human interaction there. And you probably have other relationships that are like that, at the convenience store or wherever, right? In your neighborhood, maybe even, with some of your neighbors. And all of those relationships, when we think, well, this is the key of thinking about identity systems as foundations of relationships. Every relationship is unique, and therefore every relationship needs different attributes, different levels of trust and confidence, maybe different levels of privacy or authenticity. And because of that, there's really no single relationship type that can serve for all of them, right? This is the fallacy of thinking that there's a universal identity system. You mentioned the Twitter thing, right? And that's just another example of, something that you hear over and over. Well, if we just had, right, a, universal identity that was tied to a physical body, then the whole problem would be solved. And I think that is not only mistaken, but dangerous, particularly from a privacy standpoint. So the idea of fluid pseudonymity, yeah, that's a hard word to say, is is that we have thousands, maybe more than that, of different types of relationships with everybody from the bank teller to the most intimate relationships in our lives. They all have different needs. They all have different foundations. They have different levels of interaction and different ways that we interact. And so by creating identity systems, the administrative identity systems we talked about earlier, what we've done is we've allowed one side of each relationship to create a system that works for them in the relationship. But we've never given people the opportunity to what I call it digital embodiment, right? The idea that you are an autonomous individual and can act as an autonomous individual online. And so because of that, it's very hard for you to create a different type of relationship with every interaction you have, right? Twitter wants to have a single type of relationship. At least that's, what I surmise from this whole verification thing. And that is a relationship between verified people and Twitter. And this is an interesting point, because when we think of social media, we think of having relationships with other people on the platform. And certainly that's true, but those relationships all occur within the administrative bounds set by the platform operator. And so the platform operator is deciding how those relationships are formed, what patterns they can employ. Can you like or dislike? Well, that's up to Twitter, right? That's how they design the platform. And because of that, all of those relationships are necessarily, I'll say skewed is maybe a word, skewed towards how Twitter wants those relationships to be. And of course, they're doing it for Twitter's good, right? You might get some good out of it, but that's kind of an after effect of they're trying to create a platform that serves them. And, it's not just Twitter. Obviously that's the one that's in the news right now, but almost every administrative system is building the system for their own purposes, and therefore skewing the relationships that can happen on it towards whatever serves them best, not what serves the relationship best. So, by taking this locus of control and putting it in the individual, right, by digitally embodying them, the hope is that we can allow relationships of many different kinds, right? Every relationship can be unique because it's based on the attributes and interaction patterns that are necessary for whatever that relationship needs. And of course, they're fluid because they change all the time, right? One of the things I say in the book is that in one sense, you are the same person you were when you were 16. In another sense, you're a completely different person than who you were when you were 16. Both of those statements are true, right? And digital identity systems need to be able to allow both of those statements to be true.
We talk about like real life or physical world examples, like I talked about the bank, or you talk about being at a Coke machine talking to people. You also give a really good example in the book about the different interactions that you have at a restaurant, for example, throughout the whole experience of how you're interacting with the restaurant, with the payment processors, with the people you're eating food with. And as we kind of move to the digital space, there's new participants that are there that are kind of facilitating or brokering trust. And identity service providers kind of have found a massive space to kind of create value, I guess, for relying parties on the internet, which is relying party in itself is a term that we, I guess, don't use in the physical world today. But IdPs don't exist in the physical world today as well. It's kind of a creation in the digital world just because they were needed. And I guess the identity service providers, IdPs, they're facilitating the creation of that one side of the relationship of the locus of control being with them or with the relying party, wherever that is, just because that's, again, what has been needed to work to create trust on the internet, or I guess to allow the IdPs to do their job of identifying people and attesting to the integrity of the relationship that's trying to happen. I know you've been spending a lot more time kind of on enterprise systems and on the back end, and perhaps a little bit more on access and access policies, but it would be interesting to just talk a little bit about, if we just talk about identity service providers that are performing identification and authentication processes, and just thinking about the jobs that they're doing now, as we move more and more towards user-controlled digital identity systems on the internet, how does their role change? How do they need to adapt? Do they still need to provide the same value or the same services? I'd be very curious to hear from you on that.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good question, because right now we have this view of how the internet works. And of course, if you go back 10 years, there was a different view of how the internet works. It's always changing, right? So I'm sure it will evolve, but yeah, the very notion of an identity provider is, I think, a little bit grandiose. In reality, what so-called IdPs or identity providers really provide is outsourced authentication, maybe a few unverified attributes, right? That's about it. So if I'm a relying party and I'm relying on an identity provider, what I'm really doing is I'm outsourcing my authentication. And there's nothing wrong with that in the sense that authentication is a hard job. It's good to get it right. It requires lots of just little details that most companies don't want to do. So, I think in that sense, the idea of, OpenID, right, is probably the best known way that works. The idea of using an identity provider in that sense is really very useful and has provided great growth for, what we think of as Web 2.0 kinds of companies. On the other hand, like I said, it's actually much more limited than the name identity provider would mean. And because you can't outsource a relationship, right? You can outsource the authentication. You can't outsource the relationship. You could imagine you're using your Google sign-on to sign on to, I don't know, where can you sign on with Google sign-on? Lots of places, right? I mean, not your bank, right? They don't allow that, but let's say you use it to sign on to your university, or you use it to sign on to a merchant that you're going to buy something from, right? In both of those cases, both of those relying party, the merchant and the university, have outsourced their authentication problem to Google, but they still have a very unique and different relationship with you than anything else, right? So a university relationship obviously is very, very different than a relationship you have with a merchant, right? The university relationship is generally long-lived. It involves, lots of different things. I mean, universities are communities as much as they are anything, whereas the relationship with the merchant is probably, strictly transactional. And so, the idea that we could have an identity provider that provides the identity for you to the university or to the merchant is kind of just laughable. Each of those parties are going to have their own account system that keeps track of whatever information they need in order to service the relationship that they have. And, and like we said, those relationships are very different. The nature of what the merchant stores versus the nature of what the university is going to store about you is very different, because they're very different relationships. So I think, this idea of identity providers, I think, we're going to look back on it as kind of this period where it solved a very, very hard problem for lots of companies and spurred growth by creating, trustworthy authentication, but it's going to go by the wayside. And so you ask, how might it evolve, and, what might IdPs look like? Well, I mean, we already have great examples in the physical world. I carry an identification card, right? In the States, it's a driver's license, right? In other countries, you have a national identity card of some kind. And I can use that when I go into the pharmacy to prove something about myself, right? Like my age or my address or something like that. I can also use it when I apply for a job to prove something about myself. So in a sense, you kind of think of that, it's an identity provider, right? It feels like an identity provider in the sense that it's being used by a relying party to get information about me. But on the other hand, it's very different than the way we think of identity providers on the internet, right? It's not really about authentication. There is some of that, I mean, clearly the identity card has a sophisticated biometric on it called a picture that whoever you're presenting it to can look at and say, oh yeah, that really looks like Phil. And it has a set of attributes, but what they're providing is those trustworthy attributes, right? In particular, a national identity card from a government of some kind is trusted to have the right birthday on it, right? So it gets used all kinds of places. On the other hand, that's not the only kind of identity card we use. I mean, I might have an employee identity card, and I might use that at the bank to prove that I'm employed by a certain company, or, I can use my university identity card at merchants around the university to get discounts, right? So in all of those cases, that feels similar to what we think of as an IdP, but what is happening there is very different. What's happening is the transmission of trustworthy attributes from one party to another. And so I think what we're going to see online is an evolution towards that model where, really what I'm doing is I am the locus of control for my identity, and I can create my own certifiable identifiers, right, cryptographically, and we can exchange them, but that doesn't tell you very much about me. What it says is, okay, now you've got an identifier that you can use for me, that you can trust what is controlled by me, but that's about it. But now I can layer on top of that, oh, I can prove to you what my birthday is, or I can prove to you what my name is, or, other attributes that might be important to you. Now you're not just getting, outsourced authentication, you're getting whatever attributes happen to be important for the relation to support the relationship that we're trying to create. So I think that's, where we're going with, self-sovereign identity, or SSI, is trying to get to the point where we have people who are digitally embodied, who are the locus of control for their identifiers and their relationships, can use credentials from trustworthy sources in order to prove things about themselves to support as many different kinds of relationship types as are needed in order to live an effective and operational digital online life.
It's clear that identity is about the relationship, and it's clear that identity providers don't know the context or specific details of the relationship because it's not their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But they're being relied upon for authentication, not necessarily identity, even though identity is in the name today. One of the things I'd heard someone mention, I wish I could remember who said this recently, but I was like, yeah, that's quite true, is that you use the example of presenting a government plastic ID. Trust is in the actual government stamp on the ID. Basically, it's not necessarily in the attributes and the things there. It's just that I see that it's actually been issued by a trusted entity, a government, that kind of brings up the level of trust that I'll have towards you. And then you kind of get into trustworthy attributes, and I feel like that's definitely an evolution that we don't have in the physical world today, right? And back to the first question of, we need explicit knowledge on the internet to have machines run and build trust. Well, trustworthy attribute transmissions seems like it's the input needed to elevate that to the next level. And so I really like how you describe, you're never going to outsource your relationships, but you could outsource your attributes to attain the digital embodiments that we don't have today online. Does the term relying party need to change as well? Because when we talk about relying party, it often gets mixed up with verifier, and I feel like they don't necessarily mean the same thing, because in the physical world, I could be a verifier of an ID, but I'm not necessarily relying on an IdP or someone there. How do you feel about the term relying party and the term verifier, and how they're misused or should be used properly?
Yeah, I've kind of used them in some ways interchangeably. I mean, relying party, like you say, has been a term of art in the OpenID and OAuth space, and has been picked up by others because of that, because they are relying on the IdP to provide them with unauthenticated identifier, right? That's why they're relying on that. In the SSI space or decentralized identity space, people have used verifier because that specifically they are verifying a credential that is transmitting attributes. And so those two terms have kind of grown up independently. But I think it's probably okay to think of verifiers as relying parties in the sense that they're relying on the attributes being transmitted from some other entity, although there could be more than one, right? We typically don't think of a relying party relying on more than one IdP at the same time, whereas we could obviously think of a verifier relying on the attributes from multiple credentials at the same time. So, I think it's slightly different, but I don't really have a problem with calling them relying parties. But, on the other hand, you don't want to get it mixed up and have people think you're talking about OAuth or OpenID either. So you said something else when you were starting, you were talking about trust and trustworthy. And I think it's interesting to break that down a little bit, right? Why do we trust this government ID that's placed in front of us? Because there really are two different concepts there. There's something I call confidence or refer to as confidence, and there's something that we commonly refer to as trust, right? And trust is relying, and there's that word again, on someone else to perform a task where we have no guarantees that they will, right? So when you trust someone, you essentially are just putting yourself out there, right? You're making yourself vulnerable and incurring risk. So vulnerability, risk, and trust all go together. On the other hand, confidence, right? If I have confidence in something, that's getting away from trust, right? And this is a spectrum, right? It's not, oh, you have trust or you have confidence, right? You can start on the trust and get more and more confidence that something's going to happen because you interacted with somebody a lot and so on. And confidence in the digital realm, we can get through cryptography. Right, so a lot of things we care about. So think about presenting that plastic government ID. What do you care about? You care that it hasn't been tampered with. You care that it's being presented by the person who it was issued to. You care maybe that it hasn't expired. It depends on what you're relying on it for. And you care about who issued it, right? You want to know with confidence that it was issued by a certain party. And so, in that plastic ID, right, it has all of those attributes. It's been designed to be tamper-proof. It has a picture on it, so you know that the card you're looking at was issued to the person who's presenting it. It has an expiration date on it, if that's relevant, and it has the identity or the identifiers of whoever issued that. Now, beyond that, you don't know very much about it. Like you said, we have to trust that the entity who issued it did a good job of proofing the attributes, right? So if I present a plastic ID card that looks exactly like a government ID, but it was issued by, Phil's friend Matthew, well, I mean, why should I trust that? It has all of the confidence, right? It can have all of the confidence that we just talked about, but it doesn't have the trust of, do I believe that this entity who's issued this card actually did the job of proofing the attributes? And so both trust and confidence enter into that interaction. And I think sometimes we mix those up to our detriment.
Yeah, which makes me think that then trust is more about accountability, which is more of kind of a governance or a human problem to be solved, right? Through cryptographic trust, I can know something hasn't been tampered with, but if I want to know that something's being accurately represented, or if I want to know that something has authority, or more of these trust questions, I guess it's more about accountability, which is probably something that lacks on most of the administrative identity managed internet today.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, once you get into trust, the only way you can really establish trust is through governance, right? The governance is what gives you gives you the ability to trust in this card, right? I mean, in the case of a government issued ID, the governance is obvious, right? I mean, we live within that governance, and we can understand the rules very clearly. In the U.S., driver's licenses now have a little yellow star on them, which means that they comply with the Real ID Act, which says that, the address and the birthday and other things were proofed using birth certificates or whatever, right? There's criteria. So the card itself actually carries a trust mark. And, but that's all governance, right? In order to know what that yellow star is and know what the laws are about it, you have to have some confidence that the laws are being enforced. I mean, that's all governance. And it has nothing to do with cryptography or, in the case of a plastic ID, the design of the card or anything like that.
I like that. Trust marks are governance. There's more and more trust marks that are coming out now. I think more and more people, like the longer you spend time in the digital ID space or advocating for user-controlled digital identity systems, at some point you reach the conclusion that, yeah, I can't just solve the problems using cryptographic trust.
Yeah,
so I need trust marks.
It solves an important part of the problem, right? I think of it as the lower half of the problem, right? It's all the stuff that we can just get out of the way with cryptography and never have to worry about it. But you still, even if I know that this credential was issued by a certain identifier, I still have to know whether I trust that entity or not.
Yeah, which I think we could spend a whole hour talking about cryptography and kind of what it's unlocked for. For people's, for taking back your locus of control online or for gaining sovereignty. And I think it would be interesting to do a whole episode on that, but that's for a later date. In the book, you also talk about kind of the relationship, or at least the trade-offs that happen between three different properties. And those are the properties of privacy, authenticity, and confidentiality. And you give some examples in there as well. And I think a lot of people confuse the terms privacy and confidentiality, as you explain quite nicely in the book as well. Could you explain kind of this triangle or this trade space, these trade-offs that happen between these three properties?
Yeah, so when we start to get technical about privacy, right, we have to clearly define what privacy is. And when we talk about privacy, just with friends, when most people talk about privacy, they're mixing up the concept of privacy and confidentiality. Right? They might say, well, I want my letters to be private. What they really mean is they don't want them to be read. That's a confidentiality issue. The way to distinguish it technically is to think about confidentiality being dealing with the content or the data, and privacy dealing with the metadata. An example, if you and I have a conversation, right, and it goes over some encrypted channel, we can be assured that the content of that communication is confidential. Right? Now, is it private? Well, whether or not it's private depends a lot on whether others know that we talked, and specifically whether one of us can prove to someone else who wasn't part of the conversation that this conversation took place. So, that's the idea of repudiability. Non-repudiation, right? I can say non-repudiation. It's hard to say repudiability. So the idea that you could deny that the conversation took place, that's privacy, right? That's that no one knows the conversation took place, not that they don't know the content. So when you start to think about that distinction, right, between privacy and confidentiality, there's a third concept which you mentioned, which is authenticity. And I learned about this idea from Sam Smith, that there's a trade space between privacy, confidentiality, and authenticity. This trade space, right, you think of it as a triangle, and we think about these things all the time, right? The idea that you can have two of three, right? So you have privacy, confidentiality, and authenticity, pick two. Is the way people commonly talk about trade spaces. Now, in fact, it's not quite that black and white, right? In the sense that if you think about it as a triangle, you can kind of move the dot around inside this triangle more towards privacy, more towards confidentiality, more towards authenticity. So a good way to think about that, right? Probably one way that most people have had some experience with is when you open up a bank account, they always ask you for all kinds of identity documents. lay people may not know why that happens, but digital identity people know that that happens because there are know your customer laws that are related to anti-money laundering laws. And so the banks are required to know their customer, commonly called KYC, right? So what's happening there is they are trading off or forcing you to trade off privacy for authenticity, right? So they are gathering identity data so that they authentically know that they are dealing with you. And because of that, now they can prove to someone else, namely the government, that they had this interaction with you, right? That's the whole idea of KYC, is they have to be able to prove to the government that they had a particular interaction. So you've given up privacy for authenticity. And, it's not necessarily the case that you got much out of that, but, the bank did because they're now obeying the law. I also talk about credit card transactions because they're interesting. So in a credit card transaction, there are two relationships happening when you pay with the credit card. So when you pay with the credit card, you have a relationship with the merchant that is largely about what you are, right? Somebody with a particular credit score or ability to pay the debt, right? That's essentially what the merchant cares about. With your bank, however, it's a very authenticated relationship because of the KYC laws that we just talked about. So those two different relationships have very different privacy and authenticity. They're not authenticating you when they take your card. They're authenticating the card. They don't have any idea who you are, really, right? They just know that the card was presented, it's legal, they got a code back, and they're going to get paid. That's all the merchant cares about. So that trade-off between authenticity and privacy, and it's almost always authenticity and privacy, because confidentiality is so easily gained, right? We just encrypt and we've got confidentiality. So we're almost always trading off authenticity and privacy. Another example, think about a movie ticket. When you use a movie ticket, right, it's very, very strong on privacy and very weak on authenticity because it has really no tie to you at all, right? All it means is that you have the right to sit in a seat in a particular theater at a particular time, right? That's what the movie ticket means. And it's, the ticket can be readily recognized by the ticket taker. They don't care at all about who you are. So that relationship is very strong on privacy, very weak on authenticity. But I had an interesting experience last year, about almost exactly a year ago, because we went skating for my wife's birthday. And the skate park, you buy a ticket just like you do at a movie theater, but they also had you provide ID and sign a document, which essentially was absolving them of the risk of going into the ice skate park. Right? So that relationship could be strong on privacy, but because they're worried about risk, you mentioned accountability. Because they're worried about risk, they want someone who can be accountable. They want you to be accountable, not them. So they have you sign this and they take your identity card. And so now they have they've authenticated you. They know exactly who you are. They know all of the details that were on the card. And so you don't have very much privacy in that relationship because it's almost all gone to authenticity. You go back to the bank for a minute, right? Even though the bank is an authenticated relationship, we're not really very worried for the most part about our banking transactions, whether or not they're private. We assume that they're private, right? That the bank will not disclose them to others. And so, but that's not the case really, right? They're very authenticated. So they're not private in the sense that we've talked about. We think of that as, I think of that as functional privacy, right? In the sense that it's functional, that privacy, because I don't worry about the bank disclosing my transactions, but it has latent or provisional authenticity because they've collected the information and they could, if they needed to, prove to someone that I actually did a particular transaction on a particular date. But they don't do that as a matter of course. The skating park is a different matter, right? Because I really don't know what they're going to do, right? There's not very many laws governing how the skating park's going to deal with my data, and whether they're going to, post it online. I mean, I don't know. There were no promises made, right? So in that case, I don't feel as strong about the privacy of my data at the skating park as I might at the bank. So it's an interesting idea that we trade this off all the time. Yeah, I think it also speaks to the idea of privacy maximalism. Sometimes we think of privacy as an unalloyed good, that the more privacy we have, the better. But in different relationships, we need more or less privacy, depending on how much authentication we need, right? So we can think about that, how much authentication is really necessary and how much is being used. Sometimes we're authenticated not because it's necessary, but because someone wants to surveil us or sell our data to someone else, right? And so when people talk about privacy online, that's really, I think, what they're getting at. They're not worried about, the fact that the bank knows who they are. They're worried about the fact that people are authenticating them, or companies are authenticating them unnecessarily and getting rid of privacy, trading that off for their own good, right? Not for any particular business reason.
Which ties it back to the locus of control. At least being your own locus of control, you could start controlling that. And I think probably as humans, just generally speaking, we always think as something as like black or white, but these concepts are always on a spectrum, and based on the type of relationship or what we feel comfortable with, we'll decide where we kind of want to go on that spectrum, right? Giving someone access to my MailChimp marketing account by giving them my credentials to that is not the same as me giving someone that same person my banking credentials, for example. It's kind of all this stuff is on a spectrum, and it seems like the way you broke it down of like the need to know what you are versus who you are, it also plays into where the other entity that you're dealing with will kind of ask for you to play on that privacy versus authenticity spectrum as well, where the bank needs to know who you are versus your credit card terminal or transaction just needs to know that you have enough credit. So just like some attribute that you have, but not necessarily about you. And
I think that deserves probably an exclamation mark, in the sense that I think many people, when they think about digital identity, almost always go to the who as just a matter of course, right? Digital identity is about who you are, right? That's the idea of let's create a single identifier and tie it to a body, right? So we know who is making this. But most things that we do, online or offline, don't really need to know who you are, right? They need to know what you are. They need to know certain attributes about you in order to create a relationship. The who is often unnecessary, and we need to be more aware of that, I think. Yeah, there's not necessarily the same need for the same level of accountability across the board there. So you could basically play more on, you said, the confidentiality side, which you get out of the box kind of foundationally with a lot of the cryptography that we use, and you're able to achieve the privacy that you need on kind of closer on that side of the spectrum. As we're wrapping up here, we just have a few minutes left. One of the pieces I wanted to touch on with you, we kind of talked about identity service providers, the role that they play in establishing trust or facilitating relationships. I would like to hear from you based on kind of your recent experience on more of the policy and the access control side of things, because I think that's just, by a lot of the community, very underestimated what goes on behind the hood there, and how, as even we're evolving identity systems to more user-controlled digital identity systems, this is all core infrastructure that is still needed to manage relationships and other stuff. So it would be interesting just to hear kind of what has wowed you about this space over the last little while. And so I think one of the things that is, I probably have underestimated throughout my career, is the sheer complexity of authorization and how hard it is to get right. And I think as we move to, things like zero trust architectures, right, which is, one of the hot buzzwords lately, zero trust meaning that we don't, I think the idea comes from, we used to have firewalls, right? And once you got past the firewall, we trusted everybody who got past the firewall to do whatever they needed to do. Whereas zero trust says, no, we're not going to rely on a firewall. Every action is going to be authorized, right? We're going to provide access control for every action. That's what I think people mean when they say zero trust. That has just elevated the idea of access control a lot, particularly as companies try to grapple with fraud and hackers and all of the other problems that they have to deal with. One of the things I say in the book that I think is still true is that auditing is a lot cheaper than access control, right? So we need to be careful that we're not overusing access control, because it's a lot easier to just check every once in a while, make sure everything's gone. But of course that doesn't work, right? I don't want auditing to protect my bank account, right? I want strict access control on my bank account. So we need access control. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate is just, if you're a large organization with lots of resources and policies attached to all of them, how difficult it can be to make sure that that whole collection of policies is correct. And I think that's an area that is going to have some play in the future, is this idea of how do we create access control systems that are easier to manage, easier to ensure are doing the right thing. They can be audited easily. We can modify them and know that the modifications do what we want them to do. We can be assured that we are protecting sensitive resources without overprotecting resources that don't need to be behind access control, right? You shouldn't have to log in, for example, to just be able to cruise around an e-commerce site. And so I think this is an area that is going to see a lot more discussion and growth in the future. The last decade, we got this idea of attribute-based access control, right? Kind of coming off of role-based access control. Attribute-based access control allows things to be much more finer grained. And so now we have policies that can be separated from the systems themselves. And so I think we've got a good architecture. Now, building on top of that, I think we're going to see a big opportunity for companies in that space.
And I know it's a bit unfair just with a few minutes to go into a big topic like that. So I think we could spend, again, a full hour just on this, and maybe that's something we want to do in the future. But I think what's exciting for me too is just, and you made this comment before, which is for me one of the big value propositions of credential attributes, is that you could rely on attributes from multiple sources or from multiple credentials coming from multiple issuers, with different levels of privacy preservation on top of them. So as we start getting kind of more experienced with mixing and matching different types of credentials together from different origins, it'll be interesting to see the impact, like the positive impacts that could have on the attribute-based access control systems.
I think you hit on a really interesting point, that credentials can simplify how attribute-based access control works, right? Because imagine you're a large enterprise and you have lots of far-flung systems that you need to control access to. The way we've traditionally thought about, policy-based access control, there's some sort of attribute store. Now, it could be multiple attribute stores, but they're somehow centralized, right? That the institution has to keep track of all of them. And they might have gained information from you. You might have gone into your branch, for example, and shown them a plastic ID card, and that's how they got your birthday. And they know that they trust that birthday attribute because of that. Nevertheless, they have to store all of it, which means they've got to store it all, right? So there's a security problem there of storing lots of data. It costs money to store data. It's not free, because you've got to know when to retire it and all of those things. Credentials potentially reduce that. I'm not going to say they do away with it, but they'd reduce it, because now two different parts of the company could get information from, say, your employee badge, or from a customer from their credential that they have from from somebody else, maybe a bank or someone. And because of that, they can use those attributes. They can trust them and they can use them. And the credentials are coming from the person trying to gain access, not from, some central store somewhere. So I think it gives us an opportunity for architectural flexibility and reduced cost that we have not necessarily thought a lot about yet.
Bill, thank you so much for doing this with me. We will link your new book, Learning Digital Identity, in the show notes here. I would urge everyone that is interested in digital identity and listens to this podcast to go check it out. It was, as I was telling Phil before we started this conversation, there's so many nuggets in there, even for people that spend a lot of their time in this space. So I would urge everyone to go get it. There's a gold mine in there. So thank you very much, Phil, for doing this.
Thank you. It was great to talk.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.